A man searches for his estranged father but is only confronted by the sins of his father's past. Juan promised his mother that he'd find his father and make him pay for abandoning them. However, he gets lost while searching for the village of Comala. He eventually meets a bundio who guides him to his destination. However, when Juan mentions that his father is PedroPáramo, a bundio pauses in thought before revealing that he is also the man's son. They soon approach the village, but Juan's surprised that it's abandoned. A bundio also reveals that Pedro died years ago. He then advises Juan to look for Eduviguez for a room to stay in before heading on his way. With that, Juan continues to Comala alone, recalling his mother's stories of how the town used to be flourishing. However, he sees that the village is now a wasteland, and with his father already dead, his journey's for naught. As he looks into one of the houses, a woman passes by, so he asks where Eduviguez lives. The woman, Dorotea, points him to the pink house before leaving. Juan soon meets Eduviguez, who welcomes him to her dark inn. He finds that the place is full of items, so Eduviguez explains that many who fled the town have left their belongings there for safekeeping. However, none have ever returned for them. She then assumes that Juan is Dolores' son since the woman told Eduviguez that he'll be arriving today. She takes him to the attic, but there's no bed since Dolores didn't give her time to prepare for his arrival. Finally, Juan points out that his mother died 7 years ago, yet Eduviguez only comments that it must be why her voice was weak. Eduviguez then offers the man dinner, and Juan promises that he'll join her downstairs later. For now, he lies down on the floor to rest. Decades ago, Pedro spent his last day with his beloved Susana. The woman was leaving the town she hated but promised her friend that she'd visit him. However, Pedro knew that she'd never return. The day after this, Pedro watched as Susana left town with her father Bartolome. Pedro clung to the memory of Susana days later until his mother found him in the privy, accusing him of avoiding work. His grandmother also told him to go and work, but Pedro argued that he wasn't getting paid. His grandmother reminded him that he was supposed to work to learn, yet Pedro refused to take orders. On another morning, Pedro felt his father waking him up. Moments later, he woke up to hear his mother's cries. She told him that his father was killed, despite Pedro having felt his hand just seconds ago. In the present, Juan joins Eduviguez downstairs. Eduviguez recounts that when Dolores married Pedro, she asked her to take her place during their wedding night, but by the time Eduviguez reached him, Pedro was already asleep, tired from the night's events. Eduviguez then reveals that Dolores always hated Pedro since he complained about everything she did. Eventually, he sent Dolores away to live with her sister, which Juan confirms as he grew up with his aunt. Eduviguez then grows quiet, saying that she can hear Miguel's horse galloping around. However, Juan doesn't hear anything, so Eduviguez assumes that it's her sixth sense hearing the horse. She explains that Miguel was the only son Pedro acknowledged. Miguel used to spend time in Eduviguez's house until he met a girl from the neighboring town. One night, he didn't return after his visit, but his horse was heard walking around the streets. During one evening, however, Miguel visited Eduviguez, explaining that when he visited the lady, he saw nothing but fog. This convinced the woman that he was dead and she was speaking to his ghost. In denial, Miguel argued that the last he remembered was having his horse jump the fence his father built so he didn't have to go around it. After that, he only saw smoke. This only confirmed Eduviguez's theory, so she tearfully advised Miguel to go in peace. Not long after this, Miguel's body was found and the town held a mass for him. However, Father Renteria refused to bless him, as he believed that Miguel was evil and shouldn't go to heaven. An adult Pedro merely stared at the priest in rage. That evening, Renteria had dinner with his niece, Anna. He reminded her of her allegation against Miguel, and she admitted that she wasn't sure if it was really him. It was dark when she was attacked, though the man who harmed her told her that he was Miguel. The man claimed that he wanted to apologize for having her father killed, but instead took advantage of her vulnerable state. On another morning, Maria approached Renteria to ask him to bless her deceased sister. However, when she told him that the woman had taken her life, the priest refused since the act was in defiance of God. Because of this, Maria and her family could only mourn at home where the body of her sister, who turned out to be Eduviguez, lay. In the present, Eduviguez recalls that she's also dead, so she leaves her guest. Hearing something in the distance, distance, Juan looks for the woman but hears a man's voice in the attic. When he gets there, however, he finds it empty. Just then, Damiana appears. He recalls that she was his mother's friend who took care of him when he was little. Trusting her, he decides to follow her out of Edoviga's house. As they leave, he recounts hearing a voice upstairs. Damiana assumes that he heard Toribio, who was hanged there. Years ago in that same building, Toribio received papers from Fulgor, ordering him out of Pedro's land. However, the man laughed at their demands. With this, Fulgor went to Edoviga's to ask if they could rent the room in the attic. Days before this, Fulgor approached Pedro to report all the debts he owed. His family had used up all the resources in the village, which Fulgor previously warned Pedro's mother about. He suggested that Pedro sell his land, but the man refused and came up with other means to settle their debts. First, with the Preciado sisters. One of the sisters lived in Colima while the other owned the En Medio ranch. Pedro decided to marry the one on the ranch, so he told Fulgor to send his proposal to the woman tomorrow. With this, Fulgor visited Dolores the next day, who was smitten with the idea of Pedro wanting to marry her. However, she refused to get married immediately because it was her time of the month, which would get in the way of their wedding night. Still, Fulgor assured her it'd be fine. He then got up to leave, but not before telling Dolores that after their marriage, she'd have to share her land with Pedro. After he left, Dolores asked Damiana for help to speed up her red day. She also expressed her excitement over marrying Pedro, even if he'd hate her afterward. Fulgor then reported to Pedro that Dolores would marry him. Sure that his plan would work, Pedro ordered Fulgor to meet with Toribio next and have him surrender part of his land to them. Fulgor argued that Toribio's measurement of where his land ended was correct, but Pedro wanted him to convince Toribio that the measurement was wrong and that they owned part of the land. Fulgor worried that this was against the law, so his employer assured him that they were the lawmakers now. With this, Fulgor took the attic key from Edoviga's a few nights later. He then joined Toribio at the table. Since the man still refused to surrender his land, Fulgor gestured for his men to take Toribio to the attic where he met his end. On the day of Dolores and Pedro's wedding, Fulgor reported to his employer that Toribio was taken care of. Pedro then asked him to deal with the last family he owed a debt to. After that, they'd begin tracking down the person who killed his father. At the party, Dolores pulled Edoviga's aside and asked her to take her place on her wedding night, thinking that her drunk husband wouldn't notice. Edoviga's refused, but her friend revealed that she was still bleeding and couldn't be on her wedding night. In the present, Damiana guides her employer's son down the empty streets. She reminisces when the village was still lively, but assures Juan that there's nothing to fear. Eventually, the echoes that remain there will leave. She takes Juan to Pedro's childhood home. Damiana shares that the man brought her there with him to be his head of household, having earned his respect since she was the only servant who never let him in her bed. Damiana assures him that he'll have a place to sleep there, but as she leaves, Juan follows her, wanting to know more about his father. She only tells him that many of the echoes that wander the town are those killed during Pedro's quest to avenge his father. As Damiana leaves, she thinks of Dolores. When Juan was only a baby, Dolores gave him to Damiana when she couldn't calm him down. However, when Pedro noticed his new wife's solemn look, he urged her to visit her sister and even told her servants to start packing her belongings, as if he was eager to get rid of her. In the present, Juan sees a pair of women, but they mistake him for one of Pedro's men who took women to him. Juan follows them, but they disappear. Suddenly, he sees a man getting beaten. The man tells his attackers that Pedro just wanted to know if he was at the wedding where his father was killed. However, at this point, Pedro decided to kill all the guests at that wedding to avenge his father. Just then, one of the attackers, Damasio, notices Juan, so he runs away in fear. He ends up tripping, and when he looks back, he finds Donis and his sister watching him. They take him into one of the abandoned houses and advise him to sleep for the night. Donis' sister then prepares a mat for Juan to sleep in before going into her own bed with her brother. They watch Juan shaking in fear as he tries to sleep, making the sister wonder if he's the one who owes the dead. Juan ends up shaking throughout the night, and by morning, he sees that the sister has prepared him a tea to help him calm down. He asks where Donis is, but the woman replies that her brother doesn't believe what's happening to them. She then approaches Juan and disrobes, asking if her sins are visible in her skin. However, Juan decides to continue sleeping instead. As he turns away from her, the woman floats away. Night falls again, and Juan wakes up to find the woman watching him sleep. She tells him that Donis was probably just waiting for someone to take his place, so now that he's gone, Juan has to watch over her. She climbs into bed and urges Juan to join her. Hesitantly, Juan joins her, but soon finds the woman turning into mud, so he stumbles out of the house in fear. Outside, he hears voices clamoring in the distance. As he stumbles travels down the street, Juan hears other voices talking about his father's sins and how they allowed it since they feared him. Juan reaches the town square but sees the ghosts writhing in the sky. The man then collapses in shock. Juan's eventually buried in town, and his spirit joins those lost in Comala. As a ghost, he befriends Dorotea and explains to her that he died out of fear. They soon sense that it's raining over their graves and that new life starts to begin in the land. In truth, however, what Juan senses is the time reverting to when the land was still flourishing. Looking through the past, he witnesses when Miguel returned home and flirted with one of the servants, Margarita. He then found Dorotea and her infant outside, and thinking of a plan, he ordered Damiana to give the woman food. Meanwhile, Fulgor reported to his employer that they'd run the Fragosos out of their lands, so his debt to them was no longer an issue. However, Fulgor mentioned that someone accused Miguel of murder, and immediately, Pedro told him to make it look like he committed the crime, knowing that the town feared him too much to retaliate. As he sees the town in its prime, Juan tells Dorotea that his mother wanted to die there, but sent him to do so in her stead. Because of this, he can't go to heaven. Dorotea says that she's lost hope of seeing heaven, especially after Renteria told her that she'll never see God's gates due to her sins. When she was still alive, Dorotea kept her child with her at all times. Meanwhile, Pedro had tasked men to search for his first love, Susana, even though they had no clue where she was. One night, Miguel rode his horse to jump over the fence that his father built. The next morning, Pedro woke up to find his men carrying Miguel's body to his room. He assumed that someone killed him, but Fulgor clarified that his son died while riding his horse. Pedro worried that this was the beginning of him paying for his sins. Years before this, Renteria brought a child to Pedro. He told him that the child's mother died, but not before claiming that her son was Pedro's. Dismissing this, Pedro told the priest to keep the child, but Renteria refused to raise someone of his blood. Seeing this as the priest calling his blood evil, Pedro decided to prove him wrong by taking the child under his wing. The child turned out to be Miguel, having only been accepted by his father to prove to the priest that he wasn't evil. After Miguel died, Renteria was forced to bless his soul despite his atrocities to his brother and his niece. After the mass, Pedro approached the priest and acknowledged his hate for his son. However, he suggested for the man to move on since God might also have forgiven Miguel by now. When the man left, Renteria prayed for his condemnation before heading to the confession booth. There, a woman confessed that she had conceived Pedro's child. Over the years, countless women have confessed to bearing Pedro's child, revealing that he had fathered many of the future residents of the town. One day, Dorotea also gave her confession, but it was about her luring women for Miguel to attack in exchange for food. This heavily troubled Renteria, more so since his niece was one of Miguel's victims. Still, Dorotea wished to be reunited with her son in heaven since he also passed away, but the priest decided that she wouldn't enter the pearly gates. After witnessing this memory, Juan hears another woman whispering. Dorotea believes it's Susana. Before Susana left Comala, she and Pedro spent their days happily together. However, after Susana's mother died, she and her father left. Eventually, Fulgor reported to Pedro that Susana's father, Bartolome, returned. However, the woman he was with acted more like his wife than his daughter. Despite this, Pedro believed that Susana was with him, given that the mines her father worked in were being threatened by the armed forces. Not long after, Bartolome confronted Susana that Pedro had asked for her hand. He scolded his daughter for having played with a man when they were younger. To dissuade Pedro, Bartolome told him that she was still mourning her deceased husband. He warned his daughter that Pedro was evil and reminded her that she was his property. Unbeknownst to them, Pedro told Fulgor to offer Bartolome whatever he needed to keep working in the mines while they'd take care of his daughter. In truth, they'd set up Bartolome's death in the mines, leaving Susana orphaned with only Pedro to support her. Not long after this, Pedro happily prepared himself as Susana was brought to his estate. However, Susana merely passed him by before heading to her room. That night, Susana struggled to sleep. As she closed her windows, she saw movement under her blanket, wondering if it was her father. The next morning, Damiana told Susana that Bartolome died 2 nights before. Susana cried but then started laughing as this confirmed that it was her father who visited her last night. She then thought of the time when Bartolome strapped her onto a platform and lowered her into a pit to see what was inside. Susana was scared, but her father insisted insisted that she search for gold. What she found instead was a skull, and the fright caused her to faint. On another day, Fulgor was confronted by a group of revolutionaries who threatened to take their land. With them armed, Fulgor ran, but they shot him dead. A farmer witnessed this and reported it to Pedro. With his foreman gone, Pedro ordered the farmer to call the mercenary, Damasio. He also called in the revolutionaries and offered them supper to show that he'd cooperate with them. Pedro asked the men what they wanted, and Perseverancio declared that they aimed to take down the government and the wealthy as they were tired of working for them. Undeterred by this, Pedro offered to fund their goals. Perseverancio doubted the man's intentions and urged his comrades to rob Pedro. His group, however, accepted 100,000 pesos from Pedro, who even promised to loan them 300 of his men to fight alongside them. With that, the group left, and Damasio approached his employer. In truth, Pedro wanted Damasio to gather 300 men to infiltrate the group and eliminate them. That night, Pedro watched as Susana pleased herself in bed, imagining her deceased husband. Pedro tried to join her, but she turned away from him, uninterested. Not wanting to disrespect his beloved, Pedro visited Margarita instead. On another night, he returned to Susana only to find that she wasn't done with her acts. Damiana arrived to tend to the lady, so Pedro asked her when Susana would forget her previous husband. However, Damiana assumed that Susana wasn't just holding on to memories of him. After the servant left, Pedro sat by Susana and mourned how he'd been searching for her for 30 years. He was so excited by their reunion that he even shed a tear. However, hearing his words only brought back Susana's troubled memories. So from thinking of intimate moments, the woman started becoming haunted by her past. Damiana found her on the floor the next day after breaking a vase. As she cleaned up the mess, Susana started talking about the things she heard from the earth. She then began feeling pain in her stomach, so Pedro arrived to check on her. For days, Pedro spared no expense to have Susana treated. However, it soon became apparent that she was dying, so Renteria was called in to bless her. However, Susana refused to receive his blessings, asking them to leave her in peace. With this, Renteria promised that they would all leave if she received her final rites. Susana agreed, and as Renteria prayed for her, she thought of being reunited with her deceased husband. However, her thoughts were also filled with how her father also joined her in bed when she was younger. After the prayer, Susana told the priest to leave, asserting that she was at peace. Just then, she huddled over in pain, so Pedro called over the doctor, but he was too late. The following day, Renteria rang the bell to announce Susana's death. People from all over began arriving in town upon hearing the bell, and what started as a procession for the dead became a festival for the tourists that lasted for days. Pedro was angered by how people were celebrating after Susana's death, so he declared that he would starve the town. Soon, he had his men burn the festival's paraphernalia to end the celebrations. Pedro then continued to sit and mourn for Susana for years, no longer addressing his duties in town. One day, Damasio reported to him that Renteria had joined the rebels since the government suspended holy services. Damasio now wanted to fight by Rentaria's side, believing that dying for the priest's cause would grant him salvation. Having no use for him, Pedro allowed him to leave. His mind was only focused on recalling how Susana's body was taken away, much like how her father had taken her away when they were young. His grief led to the downfall of Comala. Without the business that ran their economy, people starved and began leaving. Eventually, all that was left were the ghosts and Dorotea, who was apparently alive when Juan arrived. However, she starved to death after she discovered Juan dead. People who found them thought they were together, so they were buried together. As for Pedro, he remained in his manor with only Damiana to care for him. One day, however, a drunk and grieving Abundio marched to the manor. As one of the sons Pedro never acknowledged, he demanded money from his father so he could bury his wife. Pedro callously told him to leave, and the angered man approached his father. Damiana tried to protect her employer, but Abundio stabbed her before killing Pedro. The remaining villagers were alerted and took Damiana's body away before arresting Abundio. However, they left the man who ran their village to the ground, leaving him to die with only Damiana's ghost to keep him company.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.